Welcome to Oh the Humanities, a podcast produced by the University of New England Center for Global Humanities. Our conversations are devoted to shining a light on the important work being done in the humanities at UNE and other colleges across the U.S. and around the world. My name is Josh Pahigian, and I'm your host. My guest today is Yale School of Medicine psychology professor Samuel T. Wilkinson, who is the author of an incredibly thought-provoking new book titled Purpose: What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. This extraordinary book employs ideas from evolutionary biology, psychology, sociology, philosophy, theology, and other disciplines to tackle some of the biggest questions we ponder as human beings. What is the meaning of life? Is there a higher power that created us? Or are we the product of nothing more than millions of years of evolution? In short, can faith and science coexist? And ultimately, why are we here? What is our purpose? Before we delve into the book, let's meet our guest. Sam, thanks for joining me today.
Josh, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Absolutely. Sam, first I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about how this book came to be, and particularly about why you were the right person to write it. In the acknowledgments section of the book, see, people actually do read the acknowledgments.
They do, thank you.
Fellow author, I figure I have to, right? At the end, you mentioned that although the book took many years to write, the ideas for it came to you almost all at once as a sort of epiphany. I would love to hear the origin story of the book. I'd love to hear the story of when that inspiration struck you.
Yeah, and it's I'll give you a little bit of background. This came to me, this experience you allude to happened when I was a first-year medical student. I went to a religious university for my undergraduate education, and then after I graduated, my wife and I got married. We moved to Baltimore, where I went to medical school at Johns Hopkins, and it was a great experience. But for whatever reason, the first few months, I was kind of thrust into this almost existential crisis, and I was wrestling with, well, is there a purpose to my life? Is there something beyond just the day-to-day grind? And there was a period of time for several months where I was really wrestling with this question. And I was researching, I was studying. I'm a religious person. I was praying, meditating, and in a way that's difficult to describe, things just came together. It was, I'm not a person that has lots of mystical experiences, but this is maybe the exception, the one exception in my life where it was like something beyond my capabilities gave me ideas, and I could almost see the whole book before I ever thought of writing one. I remember afterwards researching certain topics and disciplines. I said, oh, that's what they call it. That's called kin selection. That's what I saw in my mind. So this was a very personal, I felt like this was an answer to my personal struggle. And it was very satisfying from both a scientific perspective and a philosophical and religious perspective. And so I said, hey, look, if this was really helpful to me, maybe it can be helpful to other people. I'm going to write a book about it.
So at Yale, you help lead the depression research program, and you're talking about this sort of existential crisis you had. And I'm imagining like a lot of people dealing with different mental health issues, including depression, are kind of having those crisis moments. So I was wondering if you could help sort of put in perspective how believing we have a sense of purpose alleviates some of those struggles that some of us might deal with on the mental health side. How does the idea that there's some greater meaning to my life, how does that connect with like giving a person a path forward to lead a healthy life? And are you able to employ some of the ideas from the book, and are other psychiatrists and psychologists able to apply some of the ideas from the book, finding meaning, finding purpose, to a path to a healthier mindset leading into their future?
Yeah, I think that definitely comes into play. Many Americans would agree that we are in the midst of a mental health crisis, right? Rates of depression and anxiety are rising, unfortunately, and there are a lot of people struggling. Certainly, part of this is because we need better treatments and we need better delivery of these treatments. But there's also something to it that doesn't quite make sense. There's never been more people than today who are taking antidepressants. There are a lot of therapists and mental health professionals. So I think we're missing something with the, what you might call the medicalization of depression. Certainly, and there are different various forms of depression, some of which are very, very well treated with antidepressants and medicines and that sort of thing. But in some cases, there's an existential form to this. And antidepressants aren't necessarily particularly good for that. So a lot of this has had to do, in my professional opinion, with the breakdown of traditional institutions from which we have historically derived a lot of meaning, particularly family and religion. As those institutions become less robust, more and more people seem to be struggling with these things. So yes, helping people find purpose can be a hugely important goal in a talk therapy session that you're doing with a patient, and as you work with them over time.
So you're talking about the ways that in our modern age, there seem to be more people experiencing these sorts of struggles, right? And do you think in the book you write quite a bit about evolutionary biology, and I'm wondering, do you think we're not quite evolved for the pressures we face in our modern lives? I'm thinking about like the very fast pace of life that we lead now, all the engagement with technology, the fragmentation of what was once a small city, a small community is now a city, and then a bigger city and a bigger city. It's just like we're almost invisible, whereas the world we were involved for was a world in which we were a member of a smaller tribe, a smaller family group that needed to support the whole, but we all had an identity. Like, are we able to sort of meet the moments of the demands of modern life with the tools that evolution gave us? And is that part of the problem? Does a spiritual life give us more of that certainty?
Well, I think that's exactly right. I think it's important to recognize that our psychologies have not really changed over the last 10,000 or even more years, but certainly our culture and our technology has changed drastically, right? We are, as you mentioned, evolutionarily adapted to live within a community of roughly 150, 200 people. But now we have, social media platforms where we can interact with thousands of people, but we don't interact with them at a very deep level, right? It's very superficial. So there's a disconnect between kind of what our brains and our psychologies are prepared for and what we are actually living. And that is part of the problem.
Here's a writerly question for you. As I mentioned in my introduction to the episode, the book requires that you dip into so many fields outside of your original specialty. What challenges did that cross-disciplinary work pose to you? Did you need to reach out to other professionals in their niche to get perspective, or were you able to be the sort of polymath that could readily dive into one field and then make the application to another field? How'd you get so many different perspectives of different disciplines engaged?
I leaned heavily on the work of others, right? As this book, as you mentioned, you could get a PhD in each one of these chapters. So I found it very helpful, and it was very grateful for the time and effort that scholars donated to help me understand more about their field. Reading over and editing a part of a chapter for technical accuracy, I did my very best to acknowledge every single one of those people. So each chapter, I tried to get reviewed by at least 3 or 4 subject matter experts in that particular, make sure I wasn't missing anything or misrepresenting the state of the field as it is currently. So I'm not a polymath. Very much, I relied on the expertise of others in this.
You're a good collaborator and willing to reach out to those who do have the expertise, and that's really a good lesson for us all, I think. And throughout academia, there's a tendency for us to stay within our silo, but the more connections we make outside our area of specialty, the more we're able to expand our own thinking. So that's wonderful. Your overall thesis is that evolution was the mechanism by which a divine being created all of us, created life. Essentially, you're arguing that God and evolution don't need to be in opposition. They can coexist. I think that's kind of right?
That's correct.
Okay, so a recent Gallup poll showed that nearly 40% of Americans believe God created us as we are now, as described in the book of Genesis. The other 60% believe in evolution with or without divine involvement. My question is, do you think people have fairly fixed ideas when it comes to this, since they're either a person of science or a person of faith, usually when they're reaching those two antithetical views? Are people willing to change their thinking? Are they able to change their thinking? Or is that too destabilizing for people? And when a book like yours comes along that tries to sort of cross the divide, is there resistance to it, or what has the reaction been to the book? And do you feel like you've been able to change anyone's thinking, or at least expand it?
I think people are most open when they're young, right? When they're teenagers, young adults. As the neuroplasticity in your brain becomes a little lower, you get a little hardened in your ways. There's some truth behind that sort of stereotype. So, over generations, I do think people are open to this. The number that you quoted from the Gallup poll, about 40% of people maybe don't believe that evolution has much or anything to do with human beings. I think part of that has to do, again, with some of the implications of what a layperson's understanding, in many cases misunderstanding of what evolution implies about human nature, origins, purpose, and so forth. And that's in part what I try to do and show, look, evolution doesn't mean we're purely selfish, right? We're conflicted. Definitely it's hard to not to admit that humans have a deep capacity for selfishness, but we also have a deep capacity for altruism and kindness and so forth. And the one of the other concepts of the book, the misunderstandings about evolution, there's a totally random process, right? I think a lot of people, when they think of evolution, they think, oh, life is just an accident. If you rewound the tape and watched it unfold again, it would come up with some totally different result. That's probably not the case, or at least there's good evidence or an alternative viewpoint to show that, hey, there were some principles here, which in theory are predictable, and it had a lot more to do with principles and mechanisms than it did with randomness.
Is that convergent evolution? Is that the term we use for that?
Yeah, that's convergent evolution.
And what are some examples from the book of like structures that different organisms developed that arose from very different paths?
Yeah, so birds, bats, and butterflies, right? They all have wings. Exactly. But their most recent common ancestor, so biologists tell us, did not have wings. So they each independently developed these structures, okay? There's lots of examples like that. When you look at a shark and a dolphin, they look very, very similar. You would think, oh, these are closely related. They're not, right? The dolphin is a mammal, and it had a land dwelling ancestor, but somehow kind of went back into the water. But of course, they have similar shape. They have similar fin anatomies and geometries, and they look very, very, very similar. So the evolutionary pressures, mechanisms, and so forth, it led them to this kind of same body form. Eyes are another example. Eyes have developed about 40 or 50 times independently, right? That's a remarkable thing. We have an eye structure that is basically identical to a squid, but we're not that closely related. We each develop them independently. And so, more often than not, most things have developed more than once. Richard Dawkins, who you may know is a famous atheist evolutionary biologist, he asked a friend, a colleague, how many quote, good ideas in biology can you think of that developed only once? And his friend could only think of a handful, right? So the vast majority of things have developed more than once. It seems that there were principles or laws that kind of guided or constrained the evolutionary process to come up with the same structures over and over again. One of the analogies that I hope is helpful. So, my background from undergraduate is engineering, and in manufacturing, there's a process that is called injection molding. And this is where you have a material that is solid and you heat it up until it melts. Most commonly these days it's plastic. And then while it's a liquid, you inject it into a hollow mold, a hollow cavity that has a preformed shape. This is how they make toothbrush handles, plastic bottles, that sort of thing. So if you could kind of look at the molecules up close, it would look like they're just kind of bouncing around, right, randomly. But you take a step back, and there's like a cavity. There's a pattern that it's filling, right? And so you imagine a mold, perhaps in the shape of this intricate evolutionary tree, and the mutations. There's some randomness there, but they're kind of filling in this void or this mold that has a pattern to it. I think that's a little bit the way things have unfolded.
So I can wrap my mind around the idea that these principles exist and that the pressures facing different species on different evolutionary tracts are the same pressures, the pressures you find in the water, the pressures you find in the air. Help me make the next leap to the idea that these patterns imply some sort of divine being.
So I wouldn't say they do. Okay. So I would say it doesn't necessarily prove this but it removes an obstacle, right? I think for me, it was hard to kind of come up with this sense of, there's a creator, but he kind of just left this whole process up to randomness, right? That didn't make sense to me. So it doesn't prove this, but it removes an obstacle to where I can say, there's a pattern here, there are principles, and it was somehow guided or controlled in some way that was predictable. And that opens the door for us to have a possibility of purpose and meaning. And it wasn't just, one thing after another in a random fashion.
That makes sense to me. It creates a space where you can hold both ideas at once. That does make sense. So you talked a little bit about this earlier, and in the book you spend a great deal of time investigating the dual nature of human beings. We have these dispositions where in some contexts we can be incredibly giving and kind and generous and compassionate, and yet the same people in other contexts can be unsympathetic and selfish and cruel. And in the book, you investigate this. So I'm wondering, first, what you learn in the course of that, and second, how does unraveling this mystery of human nature help answer the larger question, why are we here? What's our purpose?
Well, as you state, the way that nature has shaped our psychologies leaves us pulled in different directions. And if you'd like, we can get into a little bit of the mechanics of that. But there are different, what biologists might call different levels of natural selection that have operated. And this leaves us, again, with these capacities for selfishness and altruism, aggression, cooperation, and so on down the line. And this traditional classification, what most people would say, good, evil. When you combine that with the sense that we have this ability to choose, to me, this creates, again, a satisfying framework where I can infer that one of the reasons that we exist is to choose between these competing natures. Life is a moral test. Now, there's been this sense, in some ways, this is, you have this cliche of this cartoon character, right, with a little angel on one shoulder, a little dove on the other. I think that may be truer to form than maybe people have realized.
So our life is a test, and we can prove that the choices we make demonstrate we're a good person, and maybe some of us believe an afterlife awaits us. Is that is that sort of a first world or privileged sort of, or even in this era, it's easier for us to have that construct? Whereas I'm just thinking of, like, in some places in the world, all your choices are bad choices, or in sometimes some periods of history, you have less opportunity to be on a good path because you exist at a terrible place or a terrible time. How do you rectify that? Is there a same standard for all people at all times, or is the test take a different shape depending on where we are in history, where we are in society, what society we're in?
Yeah. And I will say, I don't like that word prove. A lot of, I can't prove that
I've probably said it a couple times, so I apologize.
No, that's all right.
Imply is the word.
I lean heavily on that word. But let me push back a little bit against that and share, one of my favorite books was written by a psychiatrist, Viktor Frankl. And he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And a large part of that was basically his experience in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany. So he was fortunate enough to survive, but he went through, as you say, I imagine you were thinking of those types of circumstances when you said, what about the people who every choice is a bad choice, right? So you would think that, look, in a concentration camp, everyone's going to act the same because they're under this terrible pressure. But he had a different perspective. He said, look, you could tell, even in these direst of circumstances, there were people who gave their last morsel of bread to someone else. And there were other people who were selfish and unkind even to their fellow prisoners. So his conclusion from his experience, and I don't have anything like that in my experience, was that even when you try to restrict so much of human freedom, there's still an ability to choose how you will react to different circumstances, and whether you react again with kindness to those around you, or this selfishness and this sort of me first approach.
So for centuries, philosophers have argued over the meaning of the good life, and I'm curious, how do you define the good life?
It's a good question.
And I don't know if you address it completely in the book, so
well,
there's no right or wrong answer. That's the good news.
Yeah, I will say this. I think there's this sense here, maybe lately, that we need to do anything we can to avoid negative emotion. And I don't think that's possible, right? You're not going to ever have this life where you're always feeling up and happy and euphoric all the time, right? There needs to be struggle. There sometimes needs to be sadness. But a good life, I think, is where, on balance, someone is happy more than they are sad or depressed or something like that. And the biggest factors, as far as we can even though we can't necessarily come up with a totally consensus definition of what a good life is, relationships are the biggest key to having a good life. People report less depression, less anxiety, more happiness, more fulfillment, more meaning, all these good things. We get more of that when our relationships are in good working order.
Does it matter who those relationships are with, or is it just important that we have a deep connection with at least one other person?
I think it's mostly important that we have deep connections with other people. Now, there are certain kind of relationships that are kind of easier to form, right? Our family relationships, there's a lot of biological structure to those, and we're kind of inclined to love our family, especially as parents. The way you feel to your kids, there's a lot of biological preparation in that, and it's maybe easy is not the right word, but you're naturally inclined to love and feel affection for and care for your children for obvious evolutionary reasons. I think that is kind of the most natural form of the deepest form of love and affection that nature has created.
What about people that don't have kids, though? And a lot of people increasingly don't these days.
Yeah.
Does that mean they're less? They have fewer chances to actually find happiness, or is there still meaning to be found in those other relationships with other people?
Certainly, there's still meaning to be found, and look, some of these individuals, they would love to have kids, but for whatever reason, the circumstances haven't kind of fallen into place. There is great meaning to be found in just being a part of something that is bigger than yourself. I think when if you're putting number one at the top, then that can be lonely and that can be depressing. Having said that, I do worry about people who make the conscious decision to say, I'm not going to have kids. Now, there may be some rationales that I can understand.
Worry about them in what sense?
Well, I think they're missing out. I think they're missing out on one of the most profound the most profound context of meaning and purpose in life. When you become a parent, when you have children, There's just this like there's a new chamber in your heart that you discover that you didn't know existed. So I worry that they're missing out if they consciously make a decision. Say, I'm just going to focus on work. I'm going to focus on this. Now, again, some people, they come from very difficult families, and so that's a very hard choice. And I'm sympathetic to that. But the family you're from is not the same as the family that you can form. So people can break out of those difficult cycles and find deep purpose and meaning and happiness in the families that they form.
So I know a lot of people that don't have kids by choice. They seem, how do I know how someone else feels? But to me, they seem happy enough,
sure.
Right? Is there data to support the idea that people who have children are ultimately happier?
So, and here's where we need to be a little careful with our terms, right?
How do we determine happiness?
So happiness, meaning, and these things overlap, but they're not exactly the same thing. So, like, having kids is not like, lying on the beach for vacation. Like you know that, right? It's very challenging. And
driving to soccer practice and sitting outside in the cold waiting for dance practice.
Yes.
Then. Sorry, go ahead.
But all else being equal, parents will report a greater sense of meaning in life. It's not necessarily easy, right? Because oftentimes the things that bring you meaning are not easy, right? But there is a deeper sense of meaning, all else being equal. Mm-hmm. There is data to suggest that.
Okay. So you talked a little bit about this earlier, the decline of family and religious practice. I think we touched on that. And I've seen studies suggesting that religious practice is important to us for two reasons. First, believing in a power greater than ourselves gives us an idea there's some master plan, there's some meaning behind it all. That's very comforting to a lot of people. Also, if we practice a religion, it gives us an immediate community, a support system of other people that we can rely on, that understand us. With those benefits in mind, just how concerned do you think we should be that church attendance and religious practice in the U.S. have been dwindling for decades? And why do you think they're declining? Why are fewer people going to church? And then finally, are there other social institutions that can play those roles of giving us that sense of comfort, but also providing that support? So that's a few questions.
Sure.
But riff on that if you would.
Yeah. Well, I'll say I think the most important is family, right? Family can, a stable family can provide a sense of structure, safety for a developing child, and really provide him or her with the capacity for finding meaning and purpose and developing. I do think we should be concerned that there has been a decline in religion and religious observance. The last 2 or 3 years, really since COVID, that has slowed and maybe even stopped, and maybe there may be an increase in activity and interest among young people, actually, especially with religious involvement. Overall, not that religion's never done anything bad, but overall, the data suggests it's a net positive for people. They have greater sense of meaning, they have less depression, less anxiety, more sense of happiness, more tied into the community, all these things that generally society is wanting, less crime, that sort of thing. Religious institutions are very good at teaching and conferring those benefits upon both individuals and families. So I do think we should be discussing this. And I have seen an openness to this that I hadn't seen 10 years ago at institutions such as Yale, which has, at least in the last 100 years, not been considered, a really friendly to religion type of place.
So there might be some pushback to the secularism we've been sort of continuously developing since COVID. You've seen that reverse a little bit. Why? And I know that's probably too big a question to answer, but do you think the pandemic and the isolation it forced upon us maybe made people appreciate those places like a place of worship where we could gather, or do you think the uncertainty we all experienced during that very difficult time period made people sort of look for more of a spiritual grounding.
I think that's part of it. I do think some of this was going on even before then, but it probably in some ways came to a head. But I think the so-called promise of the new atheist movement, which took root kind of in the mid-2000s there were a couple individuals, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and so forth, that said, look, religion is poison. It was a famous line by Christopher Hitchens. People have realized, and the data bear this out, people have realized that's not generally the case for the average person. And as kind of this mental health crisis, we've been delving into this, they're looking for things other than secularism to provide meaning and so forth. And I think, even though people have been leaving the church and religion formally, it's not like atheism is skyrocketing, right? Secularism is not necessarily winning these people who are leaving the church. They're starting to believe in other things, maybe non-traditional religions, New Age types of religions, that sort of thing, Wiccanism, that sort of. So there's still a lot of belief among people, but it's divested somewhat from the traditional forms of religion and the monotheistic religions that are most common in the Western world.
I'm going to tee you up with this question because I think I know the answer to it because we talked about it outside the podcast. But what's your next book going to be about while you're on the topic?
Yeah, my next book is going to be about organized religion and the benefits that most people probably don't realize that it confers, as well as the ways that it could be made better and the ways that things that has gotten wrong in the past and how religious institutions can be better and I think more attractive to people, especially people of higher education and so forth that have, for whatever reason, maybe not had a great experience with religion.
So is that the primary audience for the book, people in the secular world that have maybe dismissed the benefits of religion, or is there a wider audience?
I'm hoping to reach some of them, but also I want people who are religious to be able to stand up and say, look, I'm religious, I'm not going to shove this down your throat, but this is a meaningful part of my life, and it brings me joy, it brings me happiness. And if you want to come or look into this, I'm happy to facilitate that.
Well, the present book that you're promoting, the one that just came out last year, is Purpose. I'm really looking forward to that one. Do you have a title in mind for that one yet? Or is it too early?
The working title is Organized Religion, Why We Need More, Not Less, How to Get It, and How to Make It Better.
Okay, I like that. Well, Sam, I've really enjoyed our talk today, and you've given me a lot to think about. And I hope we can renew this conversation when your next book comes out.
Thanks, Josh. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Oh, the Humanities. As always, thanks for listening. And feel free to tell us what you thought of this conversation on the CGH social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X.